The sound of the key turning in the lock had always unsettled me. Not because of the noise itself, a simple mechanical click that most people wouldn't even notice, but because of what invariably followed. That fractional pause between the door opening and my mother's first words, heavy with the weight of everything she'd never learned to leave unsaid. She never entered praising anything. Not the dinner I'd spent hours preparing, carefully following her own recipes, trying to capture that exact balance of seasoning she'd always managed effortlessly when I was young. Not the way I'd cleaned the apartment until my hands were raw, arranging everything precisely how she liked it, anticipating her preferences before she could articulate them. Not even the small accomplishments I'd occasionally mentioned. A promotion at work, a certification I'd earned, recognition from colleagues who saw value in what I did. Instead, there was always a barbed comment, its sharp edge wrapped in the thin gauze of maternal concern. A look of thinly veiled contempt that she'd perfected over decades, the kind that made you question whether you'd actually seen it or imagined it. A criticism disguised as honesty, as if cruelty became acceptable when labeled as truth-telling, as if her inability to offer kindness was somehow a virtue rather than a choice. "You're wearing that?" she'd say, her eyes traveling the length of my body with the clinical assessment of someone cataloging defects. I suppose it's practical. The word would hang in the air like an accusation, its real meaning clear. Unflattering, unstylish, evidence of my failure to meet standards I'd never been taught and could never quite grasp. Or she'd run her finger along a shelf, examining it for dust that wasn't there, then say, "You keep things differently than I would." Not a neutral observation, that would have been tolerable, but a judgment rendered with the certainty of someone who believed their way was not merely one option among many, but the singular correct approach to existence itself. She'd spent her entire life saying that people like me didn't go far. The phrase became a prophecy she seemed determined to fulfill, a limitation she imposed as if it were an immutable law of nature rather than her own narrow worldview. She commented on other people's bodies as if it were her right, her duty even, to serve as arbiter of acceptable human form. At family gatherings, she'd whisper observations about cousins who'd gained weight, neighbors whose clothing didn't fit properly, strangers in the grocery store whose appearance somehow offended her sensibilities. And she laughed, actually laughed, at people who resembled me. I'd watch her eyes light up with something that looked almost like joy when she spotted someone whose body type matched mine, someone whose features echoed the ones I saw in my mirror each morning. She'd nudge whoever stood beside her, make some comment just loud enough for me to hear, then glance my way to ensure the message had landed. The lesson was always clear. You are the punchline, and you should be grateful I'm teaching you this before the world does. When she spoke about me, to relatives, to friends, to virtual strangers in waiting rooms and checkout lines, she always sounded disappointed, not angry, which might have implied she'd expected better and been let down. Not concerned, which might have suggested genuine care about my well-being. Just perpetually, fundamentally disappointed, as if my very existence was a letdown she'd learned to tolerate, but never quite accept. The disappointment lived in her voice when she introduced me. "This is my daughter," said with the same inflection someone might use for, "This is the discount brand I had to buy because the good one was sold out." It echoed in the way she'd sigh when I walked into a room, as if my presence itself required a deep breath of resignation. It colored every story she told about me, even the ones that should have been celebrations. "She graduated college," she'd tell people, then immediately add, "Of course, it wasn't a top school, but she tried her best, I suppose." The achievement was acknowledged only to be diminished, contextualized within a framework where nothing I did could ever quite measure up. I grew up hearing that I needed to compensate. The word itself became familiar, appearing in countless variations of the same essential message. I had to work harder than other children because I was starting from behind. I had to be better behaved because I couldn't afford to draw negative attention. I had to be more studious because I lacked natural advantages. I had to speak more softly, take up less space, apologize more readily, assert myself less frequently. "You have to make up for it," she'd say, during my teenage years, when I'd come home with good grades that were never quite good enough, with achievements that paled beside some imaginary standard she never articulated, but always seemed to reference. The world isn't kind to girls who look like you. You need to give them reasons to overlook it. Even now, years into adulthood, I could hear those words echoing in my head during job interviews, first dates, interactions with colleagues. The internalized voice that whispered I had to prove my worth, had to justify my presence, had to overcome some fundamental deficit that existed only because she taught me to believe in it. And even when I did everything she asked, when I exceeded expectations at work, when I maintained perfect grades, when I dressed impeccably and spoke carefully and monitored every aspect of my presentation, it was never sufficient. The goalposts would shift, new standards would emerge, and I'd find myself once again falling short of requirements that seemed designed to ensure I could never quite succeed. I spent years trying to decode the formula, searching for the exact combination of achievements and behaviors that would finally earn her approval. I excelled academically, thinking intelligence might be the key. I developed professional skills, thinking competence might bridge the gap. I lost weight, gained weight, changed my hair, updated my wardrobe, modified my speech patterns, trying to become whatever version of myself might finally be acceptable. But the truth, which took me far too long to understand, was that the problem had never been me. The deficiency she saw, the disappointment she carried, the criticism she offered, none of it was really about who I was or what I did. It was about who she was, what she believed, the limitations of her own capacity for unconditional acceptance. She'd grown up in a world that had taught her to value appearance above substance, conformity above authenticity, the approval of others above self-acceptance. And she'd internalized those lessons so thoroughly that she'd become their messenger, passing them down to me not as options to consider but as absolute truths to obey. The tragedy wasn't that she'd hurt me, though she had, deeply and repeatedly. The tragedy was that she'd hurt herself too, trapping herself in a prison of judgment so small that there was no room for genuine connection, for the simple joy of knowing her own daughter, for the possibility that love might exist without conditions or requirements. I'd spent so much of my life trying to be enough for her, trying to earn something she didn't know how to give. And in the process, I'd nearly lost sight of a more important question. What would it mean to be enough for myself? Ball 4, the invitation. When I signed the final papers at the lawyer's office, my hand trembling slightly as I wrote my name across documents that represented the single largest financial commitment of my life, I made a conscious decision. I wouldn't tell anyone. Not the colleagues who'd become friends over years of shared coffee breaks and commiseration about difficult projects. Not the book club members who'd listen to me process family dynamics through discussions of fictional characters facing similar challenges. Not even Sarah, my closest friend since college, who'd helped me move 4 times and knew more about my relationship with my mother than anyone else alive. The realtor had seemed puzzled by my insistence on privacy. "Most people can't wait to share news like this," she'd said, smiling as she handed me the keys. "First house. It's a huge milestone. You should celebrate." But celebration would mean questions. Questions would mean explanations. And I wasn't ready to articulate what I was doing or why. I barely understood it myself. The house sat in a quiet neighborhood about 40 minutes from the city center, far enough to feel separate from my daily life but close enough to remain accessible. It wasn't large. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a modest kitchen that opened onto a living room with good natural light. The previous owners had maintained it well, and I'd hired contractors to make a few updates. Fresh paint in soft, neutral tones, refinished hardwood floors, new fixtures in the bathrooms, a thorough landscaping overhaul that transformed the overgrown yard into something approaching actual curb appeal. I'd spent weekends there alone, sometimes just sitting in the empty living room, trying to imagine what would happen next, trying to prepare myself for a conversation I'd rehearsed 100 times in my head, but never quite believed I'd actually have. The invitation came 2 weeks after I'd received the keys. I called my mother on a Thursday evening, timing it for when I knew she'd be home from her part-time work at the church office. After dinner, but before she settled in for her nightly routine of television and crossword puzzles. "I want to show you something," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral, offering no hint of what I had planned. The pause on her end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then, "Show me what? I'm busy on weekends. You know I have my commitments." "It's important," I said, and heard the slight edge in my voice despite my efforts to remain calm. "Please, Saturday afternoon. I'll pick you up at 2. Another pause. I could almost hear her mental calculations, weighing her curiosity against her general principle that agreeing too readily gave me too much power. "Fine," she said finally, "but I can't stay long. I have dinner plans." She didn't have dinner plans. I knew her schedule better than she thought I did. But this was how we communicated. Through small fabrications designed to maintain distance. Through assertions of independence that had nothing to do with actual autonomy and everything to do with control. Saturday arrived with unseasonably perfect weather. I picked her up precisely at 2, pulling into the driveway of the small apartment where she'd lived alone since my father's death 8 years earlier. She emerged wearing what I recognized as one of her going-out outfits. Pressed slacks, a blouse with a pattern of small flowers, sensible shoes that had probably cost more than she'd admit. Her purse was clutched in both hands like a shield. She climbed into my car with a slight grunt of effort, settling into the passenger seat with the air of someone enduring an obligation rather than accepting an invitation. Before I'd even backed out of the driveway, the commentary began. "Traffic is terrible on Saturdays," she said, though the streets were nearly empty. "I don't know why you insisted on this time." I merged onto the main road, saying nothing. "That car in front of you is going too slow. You should pass it." "I'm comfortable at this speed," I said evenly. "You've always been too cautious. You need to be more assertive." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel but maintained my silence. This was her pattern. Fill any quiet space with criticism, maintain control through constant correction, ensure that I was always slightly off balance. I'd learned that engaging only prolonged it, that disagreement gave her ammunition, that the best strategy was simply to endure. "Are you really going to wear that jacket?" she asked, her eyes on my clothing now, cataloging what she perceived as deficiencies. "The color washes you out. I've told you this before. You never listen." Mile after mile, the critiques continued. My driving was too slow, then too fast. My choice of route was inefficient. The radio station I'd selected was noise, not music. The air conditioning was too cold. The car needed washing. Had I considered a newer model? This one was clearly getting old. Not once, in the entire 40-minute drive, did she ask where we were going or why I'd wanted to see her. Not once did she express curiosity about what had prompted this unusual invitation. The absence of questions spoke volumes about our relationship. I was expected to revolve around her needs, her schedule, her preferences. The idea that I might have something worth sharing, something that warranted her attention or interest, simply didn't register as a possibility. We exited the highway and wound through increasingly residential streets. She looked out the window with growing confusion as I turned into the neighborhood, past well-maintained homes with neat lawns and children's bicycles in driveways. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion, as if I'd deliberately taken her somewhere unfamiliar just to disorient her. "Almost there," I said quietly. Another turn, then another. I could feel her tension increasing, her body language shifting from critical commentary to genuine unease. This wasn't her part of town. These weren't streets she recognized, and I hadn't explained anything. When I pulled into the driveway of the house, my house, though she didn't know that yet, she stared at the front facade with open bewilderment. "Here," she said, the words sharp with incomprehension and something that might have been disdain. "For what?" I turned off the engine and pocketed the keys. My hands were shaking slightly, and I pressed them against my thighs to steady them. This was it. The moment I'd imagined and rehearsed and dreaded for weeks. "I want to show you inside," I said. She unbuckled her seatbelt with exaggerated slowness, her movements conveying reluctance with every gesture. As she exited the car, She looked around the neighborhood with the assessing gaze she'd perfected over a lifetime of judging everything and everyone against standards only she fully understood. I walked to the front gate, painted a soft blue-gray that complemented the house's cream siding, and opened it. The hinges moved smoothly, newly oiled. I'd spent an hour the previous weekend making sure everything worked perfectly, that there would be no stuck doors or squeaking sounds to distract from what I needed to say. She followed me up the short walkway, her steps cautious, her eyes taking in details. The recently planted flowers bordering the path, the new welcome mat, the brass numbers on the door that caught the afternoon light. I unlocked the front door and stepped aside, letting her enter first. The fall? She crossed the threshold with the same critical gaze she brought to everything, her eyes already scanning for flaws, for things to comment on, for evidence that whoever owned this place hadn't quite gotten it right. I watched her face as she took in the entry area, the polished hardwood floors reflecting late afternoon sunlight, the fresh coat of paint in a warm cream that made the space feel larger, the simple but elegant light fixture I'd chosen specifically because it provided good illumination without being ostentatious. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She moved forward into the living room, and I saw the exact moment her critical assessment began to falter. The space was flooded with natural light from two large windows that faced south. I'd had the contractors install plantation shutters that could be adjusted to control the brightness without blocking the view entirely. The walls were painted in a soft, soothing gray-blue, a color I'd spent weeks selecting because it felt calm without being cold. The fireplace, original to the house but recently restored, had a simple wooden mantel where I'd placed a single framed photograph. My parents on their wedding day, both of them young and smiling, before life and disappointment had etched themselves into their faces. My mother walked slowly toward the windows, her movements uncharacteristically hesitant. Her hand reached out and touched the wall, as if she needed physical contact to confirm that this was real, that the quality of the space wasn't an illusion created by good lighting and clever staging. She turned, looking back toward the kitchen, visible through an open archway. I'd had the kitchen updated with new countertops, nothing extravagant but clean and functional. The appliances were new, stainless steel but not top of the line. Everything chosen to be pleasant and practical, to create a space where someone could actually live comfortably. "Whose house is this?" she asked, her voice lacking its usual certainty. The question came out softer than intended, almost vulnerable, as if she was afraid of the answer. I'd prepared for this moment. I'd practiced the words in my bathroom mirror, in my car during lunch breaks, lying awake at night staring at my ceiling. But now that we were here, now that the moment had actually arrived, my mouth felt dry and my prepared speech evaporated. I took a deep breath, feeling my chest expand and contract, using the physical sensation to anchor myself. "It's yours," I said. The silence that followed felt thick enough to touch. She stared at me, her expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been fear. Then she laughed, a short, sharp sound that held no humor, just nervous energy seeking escape. "Stop joking around," she said, but her voice wavered. "This isn't funny." "I'm not joking," I said, my own voice steadier now that the first words were out. "I bought this house, for you to live in." Her body went rigid. The purse she'd been clutching slipped from her hands and landed on the floor with a soft thud that neither of us acknowledged. Her hands, now empty, began to tremble visibly. She turned away from me and walked to the window, moving like someone in a dream, like she needed to confirm that the view was real, that the light was genuine, that this wasn't some elaborate trick designed to humiliate her. Her fingers traced the window frame, touched the shutter slats, pressed against the glass itself. I watched her shoulders rise and fall with increasingly rapid breaths. She moved from the living room to the kitchen, her steps unsteady, running her hands along the new countertops, opening a cabinet door and then closing it, turning on the faucet at the sink and watching water flow before shutting it off again. She walked down the hallway and I followed at a distance, giving her space. She opened the door to the first bedroom, modest in size but with good closet space and a window overlooking the backyard. Then the second bedroom, slightly larger. Finally, the master bedroom at the end of the hall, with its attached bathroom and windows on two walls that created cross-ventilation and filled the space with light. She stood in the doorway of the master bedroom for a long moment, her hand gripping the doorframe so tightly I could see her knuckles whiten. Then her legs seemed to give out. She sank down onto the edge of the bed. I'd had it delivered and set up the week before, along with basic furniture throughout the house, and her whole body began to shake. The crying started quietly, almost like she was trying to suppress it, trying to maintain control even as it slipped away. But then it broke through in earnest. Not delicate tears, not the kind of crying that happens in movies where beautiful people shed photogenic drops while their faces remain composed. This was ugly, raw, the kind of sobbing that comes from somewhere deep and long buried. Her hands covered her face, and her shoulders heaved with the force of it. The sounds she made were almost painful to hear, gasping, choking sobs that seemed to tear themselves from her chest. It was the crying of someone who'd kept things locked away for so long that when they finally emerged, they came out broken and jagged. I stood in the doorway uncertain. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to sit beside her and offer physical reassurance. But we'd never had that kind of relationship. Physical affection had been rare in my childhood, limited to obligatory hugs on holidays and perfunctory kisses on the cheek. The idea of embracing her now felt as foreign as speaking a language I'd never learned. So I waited. I listened to her cry and let her have the space for it, understanding that this was something she needed to move through on her own. Finally, after what might have been 5 minutes or 15, time had lost its normal flow, the sobs began to subside. Her breathing slowed. She lowered her hands from her face, and I saw it was red and blotchy, her eyes swollen, her carefully applied makeup smeared and running. She looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Stripped of her usual defenses, without the armor of criticism and judgment, she looked young somehow, vulnerable, lost. "I spent my entire life diminishing you," she said, her voice hoarse and broken. Each word seemed to cost her something. "I made you feel small. I made you feel like you weren't enough. I criticized everything about you. Your appearance, your choices, your very existence. I was cruel. I was unfair. I was a terrible mother." She paused, drawing in a shuddering breath. "And you did this for me?" The question hung in the air between us, enormous in its implications. It contained everything we'd never said to each other, all the years of hurt and disappointment and missed opportunities for connection. It held the weight of a lifetime of criticism and the shock of this unexpected grace. Nas, the plot. No one expects. I didn't answer immediately. Couldn't answer, really. My own throat had tightened with emotion, though my tears hadn't fallen yet. They hovered somewhere behind my eyes, waiting, but I wasn't ready to release them. Instead, I walked slowly into the room and sat down on the bed beside her, maintaining a small distance between us, close enough that my presence offered something, far enough that neither of us felt crowded by the unfamiliarity of this intimacy. I waited for my breathing to steady, waited for my voice to feel solid enough to carry the weight of what I needed to say, waited until I was certain I could speak without my words breaking apart. "I didn't buy this house to prove anything to you," I said finally, each word selected carefully, precisely. "I didn't do it to show you that I succeeded despite what you said, or to make you feel guilty, or to claim some kind of victory." She turned to look at me, her eyes searching my face for meaning, for understanding. "I bought this house," I continued, "because I don't want to carry hate for the rest of my life." The statement settled between us, simple and profound. I saw her process it, saw the confusion in her expression as she tried to reconcile what I was saying with what she'd expected. "I spent years trying to earn your approval," I said. "I worked harder than I needed to. I achieved things I thought would make you proud. I changed myself over and over, trying to become whoever you wanted me to be. And it was never enough. Nothing I did was ever enough." She flinched, but I continued. "And somewhere along the way, I realized that the problem wasn't me. It was never about me. It was about you. About whatever was broken inside you that made it impossible for you to see your own daughter clearly. to love her without conditions, to accept her as she was. Tears were running down her face again now. Silent ones this time, just flowing unchecked while she listened. I could have cut you out of my life, I said. A lot of people would have told me that was the healthy choice. To walk away, to protect myself, to refuse to keep subjecting myself to someone who only knew how to hurt me. I took a deep breath, but I realized that if I did that, if I let the pain you caused me turn into permanent hatred, then you would have taken something else from me. You would have taken my capacity for compassion, my ability to choose grace over grudges, my freedom to define who I want to be, rather than letting you define me by reaction. She was fully present now, listening with an intensity I'd never experienced from her before. For perhaps the first time in my life, I had her complete, undivided attention. So I made a different choice, I said. I decided that I could give you something you didn't deserve and maybe didn't even ask for. Not because you earned it, but because I needed to prove to myself that I could. I turned slightly to face her more directly. This house is that choice made concrete. It's me saying that I'm strong enough to help you even though you hurt me. That I'm capable of generosity even when I received cruelty. That I can break the cycle instead of perpetuating it. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, her hands twisted in her lap, fingers knotting and unknotting. "Do you forgive me?" she asked finally, the words barely above a whisper. It was the question of someone who desperately wanted absolution, but feared they'd gone too far to receive it. I considered the question carefully. Forgiveness. What did that even mean? Was it a feeling, an action, a decision? Was it something I could offer genuinely, or would it be a lie wrapped in the language of reconciliation? I shook my head slowly, and I saw hope drain from her expression. "It's not about forgiveness," I said, and I saw her confusion return. Forgiveness implies that what happened is over, that we can just move forward and pretend the past didn't shape us both. But I can't do that. I can't pretend that your words didn't wound me, that your judgment didn't mark me, that your inability to love me unconditionally didn't fundamentally affect who I became. Once, I paused, gathering my thoughts, trying to articulate something I'd only recently come to understand myself. What this is about, I continued, is boundaries. It's about me deciding that I'm worth more than the role you assigned me. It's about me refusing to shrink myself to fit your expectations anymore. I gestured around the room, encompassing the house with the movement. You can live here, yes, this is real. I bought it, I own it, and I'm offering it to you. But there are conditions. She straightened slightly, wariness creeping back into her posture. The condition, I said, is that you learn to respect who I am, not who you wanted me to be, not some idealized version you built in your head and were disappointed I didn't match, but me, actually me, the person I am right now, in this moment, with all the ways I don't meet your standards and all the ways I exceed them in ways you never bothered to notice. I let the words land, watching her face. That means no more comments about my appearance unless I specifically ask for your opinion. No more criticism disguised as concern. No more comparing me to some impossible standard and finding me lacking. No more treating me like I'm a project you failed at instead of a human being you're supposed to love. My voice was firm now, not angry, but absolutely certain. If you can't do that, if you can't find a way to interact with me that doesn't involve tearing me down, then this doesn't work. Then you can't live here, and we can't have a relationship. Because I'm done accepting scraps of conditional regard and calling it love. The silence that followed felt different from the ones before. This wasn't the silence of shock or confusion. This was the silence of someone genuinely considering what they'd heard, weighing it, trying to decide if they could meet the terms being offered. "I don't know if I can change," she said finally, her voice small. "I'm old. I've been this way my whole life. What if I try and I fail? What if I hurt you again without meaning to?" It was the first vulnerable thing I'd ever heard her say. The first time she'd acknowledged her own limitations without defensiveness or excuse. "Then you'll hurt me again," I said simply, "and I'll decide whether to keep trying or to walk away. But at least it will be my choice. At least I'll be choosing from a place of strength rather than fear." I stood up, needing to move, needing to create a little distance to finish what I needed to say. "Here's what I've realized," I said, looking out the window at the backyard, where afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen across the lawn. "For my entire life, I've needed your approval. I've shaped my decisions around trying to earn it, trying to be good enough, trying to compensate for whatever fundamental flaw you saw in me." I turned back to face her, but I don't need it anymore. I really, genuinely don't. I know my own worth now. I know what I've accomplished, what I'm capable of, who I am when I'm not trying to be someone else. And that knowledge, that certainty, exists independent of anything you think or feel about me. She was crying again, quietly, but she nodded to show she was listening. "So you can live in this house," I said. "You can accept this gift, but understand what it means. It means I'm strong enough to help you without needing anything from you in return. It means I've moved beyond the place where your opinion of me determines my value." I walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at her. And that shift, that fundamental change in our dynamic, that's the real gift here, not the house. The house is just a building. The gift is that I've freed myself from needing you to be different than you are. And in doing so, I've created the possibility that maybe, just maybe, you'll choose to be different anyway. She looked up at me, her face still blotchy and tear-stained, and nodded. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but it carried weight. "Can I try?" she asked. Can we start over? Not pretend the past didn't happen, but actually try to build something different?" I considered the question. Could she? Would she? There were no guarantees. People didn't fundamentally transform overnight, especially people who'd spent decades operating from the same patterns. She might try and fail. She might not even really try, might just perform trying while continuing the same behaviors underneath. But that uncertainty was no longer my burden to carry. I'd made my offer. I'd set my boundaries. The rest was up to her. "Yes," I said finally. "You can try. The question is whether you will." I moved toward the bedroom door. "I'm going to go now. Take some time here alone. Walk through the rooms. Imagine yourself living here. Think about what it would mean to accept this. All of it, including the conditions." I pulled a key from my pocket, a spare I'd had made specifically for this moment, and set it on the dresser. "When you're ready to leave, lock up. Keep the key or leave it here. That's your choice to make. But understand that if you keep it, if you decide to move in, then you're also agreeing to respect the boundaries I've set. This isn't just about a place to live. It's about whether we can find a way to actually know each other as who we really are." She nodded again, more firmly this time. I left her there, sitting on the edge of the bed in a house I'd bought for reasons I was still fully understanding myself. As I walked back through the living room, past the kitchen, out the front door into the late afternoon air, I felt something shift inside me. Not healing, that would be too simple, too neat, but something like freedom. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for my mother's approval, wasn't hoping for her validation, wasn't trying to be enough for someone who would never find me sufficient. I was just enough. Period. Full stop. Complete sentence. And that realization, that profound, simple, revolutionary understanding changed everything.